Her father sold his pregnant daughter for a debt of $50 at a winter cattle auction. The auctioneer was working through a lame gelding when I walked in, talking fast the way men do when the thing they're selling won't hold up to a slow look. I stopped at the fence rail and watched him for a minute, the horse, the hitch in the left foreleg, the way it favored the bad leg every time someone moved it, and then I walked on. I had driven 40 miles through hard snow that morning for a pair of bred heifers I'd heard about from a man named Cutter Dobbs. Cutter Dobbs was not there. This was not entirely a surprise. Cutter Dobbs had a habit of knowing things that turned out to be only partly true. I had made this drive partly because of the heifers, and partly because it was December, and I had been on the place on Pinon Creek for better than 2 months without going anywhere. And there is a point in a winter like that. A particular morning when you wake up and look at the same 4 walls and listen to the wind and feel the sameness of it pressing in. When you have to go somewhere, even if the somewhere turns out not to have what you went for. The winter cattle auction at Reeves was not much. A dirt lot, a plank fence, a commissary shed that sold coffee and day-old rolls, and a ring where they ran the cattle through in lots while a man with a voice like a rusted hinge called the bidding. There were maybe 60 men there, some I knew, most I didn't, and a few women standing at the edges. The whole thing smelled of manure and fresh snow, and the coffee that the woman in the commissary was burning on a small iron stove. I was 43 years old. I had a small place on Pinon Creek, 92 acres, a decent well, a cabin with a loft and a main room and a south window that let in good light in the afternoon and an east window that leaked cold when the wind came from that direction, which in winter it often did. I ran 30 head, sometimes 35 when I could afford to expand, and I had a sorrel horse named Coker that I'd owned for 8 years and trusted more than I trusted most men. I had been alone on that place for 11 years, since a leaner left in the spring of 1940, and I will not speak ill of her because the fault was mine in the ways that matter. I was hard and shut off and difficult to reach, and she had tried longer than most women would have, and then she had gone, and I did not blame her for going. What I am saying is that I was alone and I was used to being alone, and I was not, by December of 1951, a man who expected his life to change in any significant way. I had settled into the shape of things. I did what needed doing on the place. I went to town when I had to. I talked to people when I had to, and the rest of the time I was at Pinon Creek with Coker and the cattle and the creek and the quiet, and it was enough. I had made it enough. The cattle auction ran until close to noon. I bid twice on a pair of young Herefords that looked sound and were priced reasonable, and I was outbid both times by a man from over toward Cuesta who wanted them bad enough to go higher than they were worth. I let them go. There were no heifers from Cutter Dobbs's mysterious cellar. I drank 1 cup of the burned coffee, which was 25 cents, and thought about the drive back and whether to take the canyon road or the flats, and decided on the flats because the canyon road was bad when the snow was frozen, and it was getting cold enough to freeze again. I was standing at the east end of the commissary shed with my hands in my coat pockets, watching the empty pen where the Herefords had stood, when I heard the sound. Not a scream, not anything you could call dramatic, just a man's voice raised in that particular businesslike way, not angry, not threatening out loud, just flat and certain the way a man speaks when he believes the matter is already decided. And then a girl's voice saying no. And then the man's voice again, lower this time, the way you speak to an animal you are reminding of something. I went around the end of the commissary shed. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I have told it a few times over the years, and I always get it wrong in the same direction. I make it sound like a decision, like I thought it through and made a moral calculation and came around that corner with intent. It wasn't like that. It was more like how you go toward a sound in the dark, not because you decided to, but because you're already moving before the deciding happens. Some part of me was around that corner before I knew I was going there. There were 3 men and a girl. The girl was young, 18, maybe 19, though afterward she told me she was 17, which was information that sat in me for a while like a stone. She was wearing a coat that was 3 sizes too large for her, a man's coat, brown wool with 1 button missing at the collar, and under it, even in December, even in a coat like that, you could see she was carrying a child. Maybe 7 months along, maybe more. Her hair was dark brown and loose, and there was snow in it from somewhere, small dry crystals of it, like she'd been outside long enough for them not to melt. She was standing with her arms pulled back, held back. One of the 2 younger men had a grip on her left arm just above the elbow, the other stood behind her. The third man, the older one, stood in front of her. He was maybe 55, with a hat that had been rained on too many times, and a face that looked like a fist, closed up, compact, not much room for expression. He was talking to her in that low, reminding voice. I said, "What's the transaction here?" Not a question, just a sentence. The older man looked at me. His eyes were pale, gray, or light blue, and they went over me the way you look at something you're pricing. He said it wasn't my business. I said I was making it my business. The younger man who didn't have a hold of her, he had a clean coat and the look of someone accustomed to being followed rather than questioned. Said that Lyle here had a debt that needed settling, and the girl was how it was getting settled, and I ought to walk on. I said, "Whose debt?" Lyle said it was his own debt, his own affair. I said, "And she's your daughter?" He didn't answer that. He looked at me steadily and didn't answer. I looked at the girl. She was looking at the ground between us. Her jaw was set in a way I recognized without being able to name it for a moment, and then I named it. It was the way a person sets their jaw when they have determined that crying will not help them and have decided not to do it. I had worn that exact expression on my own face enough times to know it. I said, "How much is the debt?" The younger man in the clean coat said that was none of mine. Lyle said, $50. There was a pause. The younger man looked at Lyle with some irritation. Lyle looked at me. I had $70-some in my coat pocket. I'd brought it for the heifers. I thought about the drive home, about Coker in the trailer, about the east window that leaked, about the 30 head that needed tending, about the shape of my life at Pinyon Creek that I had made enough, and that was going to be the shape of it for however many years were left. I thought about all of that. I said, "I'll give you $50 and the debt is done, and you are not to come near her again." Lyle looked at me for a moment. The younger man started to say something, and I looked at him in a way that didn't invite him to finish. Lyle said, "All right." I counted out $50 from my coat pocket. 5 tens, deliberate, into Lyle's hand. He closed his hand around the bills and looked at the girl once, not with regret, not with love, not even with shame, just with the expression of a man completing an entry in a ledger. And then he said something to the 2 younger men that I didn't catch, and the 3 of them walked away, around the far end of the commissary shed and out of my sight. I stood there with the girl. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the air had that particular stillness that comes after snow, dense and close and very quiet. She was still looking at the ground between us. Her arms were free now, and she had pulled them in front of her, crossed, hands tucked in the 2 big coat's sleeves. I said, "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't move. I said, "I have a truck and a place on Pinyon Creek, 40 miles north. You can come or not come. If you don't come, I'll give you the money I have left, about $25, and you can do whatever you think best with it. That's the whole of it. There's no obligation either way." She was quiet for a moment, then she looked up. She had brown eyes, dark enough that the brown was almost black. There was nothing soft about the look she gave me. It was a direct, assessing look. The kind of look that has had to learn to read people fast because reading them wrong has costs. She looked at me the way you look at a fence to see if it'll hold. She said, "What's your name?" I said, "Harlan Vess." She said, "I'm Coroner." I said, "All right, Coroner." She said, "How do I know you're not worse than them?" I said, "You don't. You're going to have to decide that." She looked at me a while longer. Then she looked at the ground again, not the defeated look from before, more like she was thinking at the ground rather than retreating into it. I waited. I was good at waiting. 11 years alone teaches you not to fill up silence just because it's there. She said, "Pinyon Creek." I said, "About 40 miles, 2 hours in this weather." She said, "All right." She followed me to the truck. I did not know what I had done exactly on the drive north. I knew what it looked like. I want to be honest about that. I knew how it looked, and I knew it was not that. And somewhere in the difference between what it looked like and what it was, there was something I would have to figure out, and I was not going to figure it out on the drive north in 2 hours of hard road and the interior of a truck. What I knew was this. I had gone around a shed and seen something I could not walk past, and I had done the most immediate thing, and now there was a pregnant girl in my passenger seat who did not know me and had reason not to trust men, and whose father had just sold her at a cattle auction for a debt of $50. Those were the facts. The facts were not complicated. What to do with the facts was going to require more thought than I had in me just then. She sat against the passenger door with her coat wrapped around her and looked at the road. For the first 30 minutes she didn't say anything and I didn't say anything, and the road unrolled ahead of us white and quiet, and the sky was the color of old pewter. I turned the truck heater on as high as it would go, and it made a sound like something laboring, but it threw heat. And after a while, I saw her shoulders come down from around her ears a little. After maybe 25 minutes, she said, his name was Ellis. I waited. She said the baby's father. He went to Korea in April. He didn't come back. I said, I'm sorry. She said, they said missing. They said it in November. My father decided that missing was the same as gone and that the baby was the same as a problem, and when the debt came up in December, he saw a way. I didn't say anything to that. I couldn't think of anything that wouldn't be either too small for the weight of it or too large for what she needed in that moment. She said his name was Ellis McGuire. He was 21. He was going to come back, and we were going to get married. I said, he sounds like he was a good man. She said he was. He wasn't anything special to look at, but he was good all the way through. There are men like that, not many. I said no. She said, are you one? I considered that. I said, I don't know, I try to be. She looked at the road for a while. She said, I'm not going to be a burden to you. I want to say that now. I said, all right. She said, I can work. I'm not delicate. I know what work is. I said, I believe you. She said, and I'm not going to be trouble in other ways. I know what men usually want when they do something like what you just did, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wanting it, but I want you to know that I said, that's not what this is. She was quiet. I said, I have a cabin and a loft, and you'll have the main room and I'll have the loft, and that's how it'll be. There's no obligation of any other kind. I bought you out of a bad situation, not for anything else. If that's clear, we can stop talking about it. She said, it's clear. She turned back to the road. After a minute, she said, why? I said, why what? She said, why did you do it? You don't know me. I thought about that for long enough that she might have thought I wasn't going to answer. I said, I don't know exactly. I went around that corner and saw what was happening, and there was a part of me that just said no. Not a thinking part, something older than thinking. She didn't say anything. I said, I've been alone a long time. I don't have much that I can do for people, but that I could do. She was quiet the rest of the way to Pinyon Creek. The place looked smaller when I pulled up to it than it usually looked to me. I saw it through her eyes for a moment, the cabin, the low shed, the corral, the creek frozen at the near bank, and it was a small, spare, isolated thing in a lot of snow and wind. She got out of the truck without waiting for me to come around. She stood in the snow and looked at the cabin. I said, it's one room with a loft. The stove is good, and I've got plenty of wood laid up. The outhouse is around back. I'll show you. There's a wash basin inside, and I bring water from the well each morning. The east window leaks a little cold when the wind's from that direction, but mostly it's tight. She said, it's good. I said, it'll do. She said, no, I mean it, it's good. I looked at the cabin. I tried to see what she was seeing. Maybe it was good compared to something, compared to what her life had been or what it had been about to become. I said, let's get you inside. I showed her around the cabin that afternoon, which did not take long, it being one room, and showed her the outhouse and the well and where the wood was stacked, and where I kept the lamps and the oil. She moved through it all steadily, taking it in, nodding, not asking many questions. I showed her the loft, the mattress there, my blankets, my few things, and said I would move them down to the main room and she could have the loft if she preferred. She said, which is better for you? I said, doesn't matter to me either way. She said, then I'll take the main room. A loft with stairs when you're 7 months along doesn't seem wise. I said, that's sensible. I moved my things to the loft while she stood at the window looking out at the frozen creek. Then I made coffee, and she sat at the table and wrapped her hands around the cup, and the color started coming back into her face. We ate supper. I had salt pork and beans and bread I'd made 2 days before, which was hard but not inedible. And then she went to sleep early, which made sense, and I sat by the stove and thought about what I had done and what was going to happen now. I did not come to any conclusions. I was good at facts. I was not good at conclusions about my own life. I put more wood on the fire and went up to the loft and lay there a long time listening to the wind. She was awake before me. I came down the loft ladder at first light, and the fire was already going and there was coffee. She was sitting in the chair by the window with her hands in her lap. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." I got my coat and hat and went out to see to the cattle. It was cold, below zero by my reckoning, and the cattle were bunched in the low part of the pasture where the wind broke. I checked them and broke ice on the water and put out hay and came back in, and she had made oatmeal. We ate without talking much. I asked her if she'd slept all right. She said she had. That was the extent of it. What I noticed over the next few days was small things accumulating. On the second morning, she swept the floor while I was out. She swept it the way a person sweeps when they have been taught that a swept floor matters, not fast, not to get it done, but attentive to the corners, working a section at a time. I noticed the floor when I came in and didn't say anything, and she didn't either. On the third day, she asked if she could come out to the barn. I said she was welcome to. She came out and watched me work through the morning. I was patching a split board in the barn wall and then trimming the feet on 3 of the cattle that had got overgrown, and she didn't try to make conversation, just watched. And when I needed a second pair of hands to hold something, she was there and holding it without being asked. She had watched, understood what was needed, and acted on it. That is not a common quality. I said, "You've done barn work before." She said, "My mother had cattle before she died." I said, "How old were you?" She said, 12. I said, "And your father?" She said, "My father had other interests." I left it there. On the 4th day, she made bread. Proper bread from scratch, with a confidence in the dough that I have never had. I make bread the way you do a chore you're not good at, getting it done, producing something edible but not more. She made bread the way someone makes something they understand, working the dough with her palms, patient, a little flour on her forearms, and the loaves that came out of the oven were the best bread I'd eaten in years. She put one on the table and cut it while it was still warm and put butter on her piece, and ate it without ceremony, like she wasn't waiting for a verdict. I said, "That's good bread." She said, "My mother taught me." On the 5th day, she looked at the east window and said, "That window needs caulk." I said I'd been meaning to get to it. She said, "Do you have caulk and a putty knife?" I said I did. She said, "I'll fix it this afternoon." I said I could do it. She looked at me in a way that wasn't quite a challenge, just a kind of directness. She said, "So can I'll do it this afternoon." I let her. I came in at dusk and the window was done. She had gone all the way around it, inside and out neatly, and the room was noticeably warmer. She was at the stove, stirring something. She didn't mention the window and I didn't mention it. What I am saying is that she made herself at home. Not with any boldness, not pushing her way in with a kind of quiet competence, just filling in what needed filling in, just doing the thing that wanted doing. There was a rightness to it that I noticed without thinking about it too hard. At the end of December, I drove to town for supplies, and while I was there, I went to see Doc Hendrick about the baby. I had to. I didn't know enough about such things, and I needed to know what to watch for and when to bring her in. Doc Hendrick had been practicing in that county for 30 years. He was a direct man with a large head and small hands and the habit of looking at you over his glasses rather than through them. He asked my relationship to the girl. I explained the situation. He listened without expression. He said, "And what do you intend for the child?" I said, "Whatever she decides." He said, "And for her?" I said, "Whatever's right." He looked at me over his glasses for a moment. He said, "All right, Harlan." He told me what to look for, what would be normal and what wouldn't, when to bring her in and when to come for him. He gave me a written list because he said I was the kind of man who would remember things wrong from nerves at the wrong moment. I thanked him and put the list in my pocket and went to Hadley's Dry Goods before I left town. At Hadley's, I stood in the women's and infants section for a while, feeling like I was in a foreign country. I bought flannel, several yards of it. I bought wool for socks, dark blue, because it seemed practical. I bought some other things that seemed likely to be needed and did not look at the price of any of them. I put everything in a flour sack and drove home. When I came in, I set the flour sack on the table and said, "I wasn't sure what you needed. If I got it wrong, tell me what's missing and I'll go back." She looked in the sack. She didn't say anything for a minute. She took the flannel out and held it and folded it and set it aside. She went through the rest of it. She said, "Harlan." I said, "Yes." She said, "You're going to make me cry." I said, "Don't." She said, "I'm not going to. I'm saying you're going to make me want to." She went back to the sack. Her hands, when she reached for the next thing, her hands weren't quite steady. I pretended not to notice, which was what was needed. January was the hardest month. Not for anything between us, we had found our way of being in the same space, the rhythm of the cabin in winter, and it was workable and sometimes more than workable. What was hard was the weather. 3 weeks of cold that went deep and stayed, the kind of cold that gets into the cattle and into the barn and into the walls of the cabin even with the stove working hard. The creek froze all the way across for the first time in years. The road off the place drifted shut twice, and I spent 2 days digging it out. I worked long days and came in cold, and she had food ready at the table, and we ate and talked some, not a lot, and then she went to sleep and I sat by the stove and planned the next day's work. That was the shape of it. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I was not unhappy, and I had not been able to say that with certainty in a long time. One night in the 3rd week of January, I came in after dark from repairing a section of the north fence that had gone down in the wind. It had been a long day and hard cold, and I could barely work my fingers. My hands were so stiff the buttons on my coat were beyond me, and I was still standing at the door struggling with them when she came over and undid them herself. She didn't comment on it. She hung up the coat and said the food would be ready in a few minutes and went back to the stove. I sat at the table and she poured coffee and set it in front of me. Then she came around behind me and took my hands, both of them, and held them between her palms. Her hands were warm, not from the fire, just warm, and she held mine between them without speaking, without making anything of it, just held them until the feeling started coming back. I sat there and let her. I did not know what to say, and so I didn't say anything. After a while, she went back to the stove and served the food, and we ate, and that was the whole of it. But I sat there afterward with my coffee and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was that I was not entirely on my own. It was such a small thing, and it was not a small thing at all. Corinna had been there about a month when she first talked about her father. We were at the table after supper, and she was mending something, one of the flannel pieces from Hadley's, making something for the baby, and I was working over the account book, and out of the silence she said, "He wasn't always like that." I waited. She said, "My father, before my mother died, he was different. I don't mean he was a good man, I think he was always mostly going in the direction of himself. But my mother steadied him. She pointed him at the things outside himself often enough that he didn't have too much time to be only what he was." I said, "When did she die?" She said, "I was 12. Fever. In 3 days, which is fast, but the doctor said it had been working on her a long time and the fever was just the end of it." I said, "I'm sorry." She said after that he went further in the direction he'd always been going, toward the bottle, toward the men who were going the same direction, away from anything that required him to think about someone else. I kept the place together for 5 years. Then Ellis came along and it gave him somewhere to put his attention on disapproving of Ellis, on telling me Ellis wasn't good enough, on being the man who knew best. And when Ellis went to Korea and didn't come back. She stopped, she pulled the thread through and knotted it. She said, "When Ellis went missing, my father was sorry for about 2 weeks. He came and sat with me and he said the right things and I thought maybe, and then the debt came up and he saw an opportunity and he took it." I said, "What was the debt?" She said, "Cards. He lost at cards." I said, $50 at cards." She said, "It doesn't take long when you play the way he does." I sat with that for a while. I said, "Have you had any word about Ellis since November?" She said, "No, missing is missing. The army sends letters that say nothing. My father wouldn't have told me if there had been word I was in his house, but I was not someone he was thinking about." I said, "When the baby comes, if you want me to write to them, to the army, I'll do that. Find out what there is to find out." She looked at me. She said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because you should know, and because Ellis sounds like a man who deserves to be known about." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "All right, after the baby comes." She went back to her mending. I went back to the account book. The stove worked steadily and the wind outside went through its business, and we sat there in the lamplight, each with our work, and it was one of those evenings that I find hard to describe because nothing was happening, and what was happening was everything. In the middle of January, I rode into Reeves for salt and wire and a few other things, and I stopped at the feed store where I had an account, and the man behind the counter, whose name was Purcell, asked me how things were out at Pinon Creek. I told him fine. He said he'd heard I had someone staying out there. I said that was right. He said he'd heard it was a girl. I said that was right too. He had a certain way of not asking the question while making clear he was asking the question, which I had always disliked about Purcell. I said she's a widow. Her husband was killed in Korea. She needed a place, and I had one. This was not precisely accurate, but it was not precisely inaccurate either, and it was the truth of what mattered. Purcell nodded in a way that told me he was not certain whether to believe it, and that I did not care whether he believed it. I drove home and did not think about Purcell again for a long time. What I thought about that January was smaller things. The way she read, she had found my 3 books, such as they were, a cattleman's handbook and a history of the Southwest, and a novel I had read twice without remembering much of it. And she read them all in the evenings, the novel first, then the history, and when she was done with a section she would sometimes say something about what she'd read, not in the way of making conversation, but in the way of a person who is working something out. She had an organized mind. I noticed that. She did not waste words, and she did not think in circles. She got to the point of a thing and stayed there. She also had opinions. This I discovered gradually. She had opinions about the cattle, not stated as challenges, just as observations, but clear ones. This cow needs watching. That heifer is going to be trouble. This pasture is getting overgrazed in the east corner. She was right often enough that I started listening to her before she finished. She had opinions about the cabin, too. In addition to the window, she rearranged the kitchen things so that what was used most was closest to hand, which sounds simple but had never occurred to me in 11 years. She moved the firewood stacking so that the dry wood was always on top, which I had been meaning to do. She made a shelf from 2 boards and a pair of nails and put it beside the bed for her lamp and her things, which was sensible and which I would not have thought of. None of it was asking permission. None of it was making a show. She just saw what was wrong or what could be better and fixed it, and the place was better for it, and she didn't need to be told it was better. She already knew. I had been alone a long time. I want to say that clearly so you understand what I am saying when I tell you that her presence changed the place. It was not that she filled it up. She was not a loud or filling up kind of person. It was more that the place had a shape now it hadn't had before. In the mornings there was coffee made. In the evenings there was the sound of her at the stove, the small sounds, the particular sounds of someone going about their work. At night there was a light through the boards of the loft floor from her lamp, soft and yellow, and it meant she was reading, and she would read until late sometimes, and I would lie there and see the light through the boards and know she was there, and it was a thing I had not known I missed until I had it. In February the weather broke for a week and then came back worse. I had a stretch of days where I was fixing fence in the morning, cutting wood in the afternoon, and checking the cattle twice a day, and I was tired in a way that went down into the bones. Corona, in her 8th month, was doing everything inside that needed doing and some things outside that I tried to talk her out of and couldn't entirely. She had a stubbornness about her that was not argumentative. She didn't argue. She just did what she decided to do, quietly, and if you objected she would listen and acknowledge the objection and then do it anyway. I admired that quality. It was useful. It was a quality that kept people alive in hard country. One evening I came in and she had rearranged the main room, not dramatically, just moved the table and the chair and put things in a different relation to the stove and the bed, and it was better. It was obviously better. The flow of the room made more sense and the heat from the stove reached more of it. She hadn't asked me. She had just decided it was better and done it. I said, "You moved things around." She said, "It was better this way. You can move them back if you want." I said, "It's better this way." She looked at me with a small, direct look that might have been satisfaction. I said, "You have a good eye for how a space ought to be." She said, "My mother did. I learned from her." She came back to her mother often, not with grief exactly, or not only grief, more like consulting. Like her mother was a reference she came back to when she was working something out. The baby came in the first week of March. I woke at 2 in the morning to sounds from below and came down the loft ladder and found her on the edge of the bed. She was past the early part of it, past the part where she might have been willing to be talked out of anything, and she was white-faced and set and holding the bed frame with both hands and not making much noise, just a controlled, careful sound on the worst of it. I had Doc Hendrick's list. I had read it several times in the past weeks, the way you read instructions for something you hope you won't have to use but know you might. I got water heating on the stove. I got the clean cloths she had set aside for this weeks ago in a neat stack on the shelf because she had been more prepared for this than I had. I did what the list said to do in the order it said to do it. She did not ask me to stay. She did not ask me to leave. She just worked through what she was working through with the concentration of someone doing a hard and necessary thing. And I stayed and did what wanted doing, and we did not talk except when we needed to. At some point in the 4th hour she said, "Harlan." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm all right." I said, "I know." She said, "I just wanted you to know." I said, "I know." The boy was born at first light. He was red and new and making his opinions known about the whole proceeding. Coroner held him against her chest and looked at him with a look I have no words for, a look that was total. That was the whole of her attention in a way I had never seen before, as if the rest of the world, including me, had reduced to background. I was at the stove with the hot water, and I looked at them and then looked away. After a few minutes she said, "Harlan." I said, "Yes." She said, "Come here." I went and stood beside the bed. She held the boy up a little so I could see his face properly. He was still working out what he thought of things. His eyes were squeezed shut and his fists were curled and his color was settling. She said, "I'd like to call him Ellis after his father." I said, "That's a good name." She said, "And I'd like him to have Vess, Ellis Vess, if you'll let me." I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "I know you might not. I know it's a lot to ask when you've." I said, "It's not a lot to ask." She waited. I said, "I'd be honored. That's a real answer, not politeness." She looked at the boy. Then she looked at me. She said, "I know the difference." I believed that she did. I went and sat in the chair by the stove and looked at the wall and felt something working in my chest that I was going to need some time alone with. I gave them the room as best I could without leaving it. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in the high country in increments. A few degrees warmer, then a cold snap, then a little more green at the edge of the creek, then a late snow, then finally warmth that stayed. By April, the creek was running high and muddy with snowmelt, and I had 3 weeks of fence work to do along the south bank where the high water had taken sections. Ellis was 6 weeks old, and Coroner was working alongside me again, which I had told her was too soon, and she had heard me out on, and then done anyway. Ellis was 2 months old by the time the ground was workable. He spent his days in a basket near wherever we were working, which on good days was outside and on bad days was in. He was a quiet baby, not silent. He had opinions about hunger and wet and being put down when he wanted to be held, but he was not a fussy baby, not a baby who cried without reason. He would lie in the basket and look at whatever there was to look at, the barn ceiling, the cloud moving over the pasture, the light on the cabin wall, with a concentrated attention that seemed too serious for a person that small and new. I had not been around babies much. My wife and I had not had children, and before that, before Alina, I had been on the move too much for children to be part of the picture. But I found that I liked the boy. Liked his company, which surprised me. I had not expected the company of something so new to be company of any value, but it was. He would look at me from the basket with his dark eyes, Coroner's eyes, and the look was not quite a smile and not quite recognition, but it was something. It was paying attention. That I respected. I carried him in the morning sometimes when Coroner was at the stove, just walked the cabin with him against my shoulder, which he seemed to find acceptable. He would put his fist against my neck and turn his head and sleep. It was a small weight and a warm one. I had not held a sleeping child in my arms in a very long time, possibly never, and the weight of it went into me somewhere and stayed. She could read cattle. That was what I noticed that spring watching her. She had a sense of what an animal was going to do before it did it, not a dramatic thing, just a kind of attentiveness that I had always had to work at, and that seemed to come naturally to her. She'd spot a cow that was about to make trouble and have herself positioned to head it off before I saw the trouble coming. She'd look at an animal and know something was off about it before it showed in any obvious way. I said, "You've got good instincts with cattle." She said, "My mother." I said, "I know, you got a lot from her." She said, "As much as I could. I was 12. I said, "What else?" She looked at me sideways. She said, "What do you mean, what else?" I said, what else did you get from her that you carry around? She thought about that while we walked the fence line. She said to me, I must have been 10 or 11. She said there are men who are worth staying beside. She said I'd know them because they do the thing that wants doing without needing to be asked, and they don't need to be thanked for it, and they don't go away when things are hard. She looked at me. She said she was talking about my father, actually, about the kind of man he wasn't, but I keep the description. I said it's a good description. She said yes. We walked the fence line, and I noted where the work was, and she did the same, and we didn't talk for a while. And the spring light on the creek was something that I wanted to hold the way you want to hold a particular angle of light when you know it's not going to last. I wrote to the Army in May, as I'd said I would. I wrote to the Department of the Army in Washington, asking for any information about Ellis McGuire, 21st Infantry Regiment, reported missing November 1951. It was a short, careful letter. I gave Pinyon Creek as the address. The response took 6 weeks. It came in a plain envelope with a government return address, and inside was a form letter with Ellis McGuire's name typed into the blanks, confirming that he had been killed in action on the 28th of November, 1951, at a position north of the Changchan River. The letter expressed regret in the language that such letters use, which is correct in its facts and entirely wrong in everything else. I brought it to Coroner in the evening. I did not try to soften it. She took it and read it and set it on the table and sat with her hands in her lap looking at the wall. I sat across from her and didn't say anything. After a long time she said, I knew. I said, I think you did. She said, I just needed to know. I said, I know. She picked up the letter and folded it carefully along its creases and held it for a moment. She said, he would have been good to you. Ellis, he would have liked you. I said, I think I would have liked him. She said he was the kind of man who did the thing that wanted doing, without being asked. I said, then he was worth knowing. She nodded once. She took the letter and went outside and sat on the step for a while in the last of the evening light. I could see her from the window. She sat there maybe half an hour, and then she came back in and Ellis was awake and fussing, and she picked him up and the evening went on. She didn't speak of it again for a while, but she was different in some way after the letter, not sadder or not only sadder, more settled. Like something that had been held in suspension had finally come to rest, which is not the same as being at peace with it, but is at least knowing the shape of the thing you are carrying. In June, there was a difficulty. 3 men came to the place on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at the barn and I heard the truck come in and came out to the yard and saw them and knew immediately that they were from Lyle, not Lyle himself, but from him, sent by him. One of them was the younger man in the clean coat from the auction. He had a different coat this time, but the same manner, the manner of someone who expects things to go his way. He said that Lyle felt the transaction at Reeves had not been completed to his satisfaction, and that he was owed an additional consideration. I said, what additional consideration? He said that Lyle had reconsidered the value of what he'd provided, and felt $50 was below fair market. I want to be clear that I was not frightened of these men. I had been in difficult situations before. I had been in the war and I had worked range work in rough country, and I had dealt with men who were not honest in ways that required dealing with directly. I was not frightened. I was something colder than frightened, which is the thing that sits in you when you see someone testing whether you are going to do the right thing and wondering what it's going to cost. I said the transaction was complete when I put $50 in Lyle's hand. Tell Lyle he has no business here and no claim on this place or anyone on it. The man in the different coat said that Lyle didn't see it that way. I said I don't much care how Lyle sees it. He said that Lyle had legal standing, that the girl was a minor in his custody, and he had not technically had the authority to transfer that custody for $50, and so the transfer was void, and she would be coming back with them. I said, she's not. He said, that's not your decision. I said, it is actually, and I want you off this property. He looked at me for a moment. He had the look of a man deciding something. The other 2 men were standing loose, the way men stand when they're waiting for a signal. I said, you should decide fast. There was a silence. The creek ran. A cow in the pasture made a sound. The man in the coat looked at me and at the barn and at the cabin and did the arithmetic. He said, this isn't over. I said, it is from where I stand. Go on. They got in their truck and drove out. I went inside. Coroner was at the table with Ellis. She had heard all of it from the window. She hadn't moved. She had sat there and listened, and she was sitting there now with Ellis on her lap and her face very steady. She said, what happens if they come back? I said, they won't. She said, how do you know? I said, because I gave them the chance to be men who make a choice and walk away with their dignity, and they took it. Men like that, given a door, they use the door. They don't want a real fight. They want what's easy. She said, and if they do come back? I said, then I'll deal with what comes back. She looked at me. She said, you're not scared of them. I said, no. She said, I was. I said, that makes sense. You had reason to be scared. She said, and you didn't. I thought about how to say it. I said, I've been on this place for 11 years, and I built most of what's here, and I know what I'm willing to stand for. That steadies a man. Scared is harder when you know your own ground. She looked at me for a while in that direct way she had. She said, that's the most words I've heard you say at one time. I said, you asked a big question. She said, I did. They didn't come back. I had known they wouldn't, but I want to be honest that the 2 days after were days when I kept my rifle close to hand and my eyes on the road. A man who tells you he was not watchful after something like that is either lying or foolish. I was neither. I watched, and I was ready, and nothing came. What I felt in those 2 days, and which I have turned over in my mind many times since, was not fear and not anger, though there was some of both. Mostly what I felt was a clear and simple refusal, the same refusal I had felt going around that shed wall, a kind of north on a compass. Something in me pointing at what was right and not moving off it regardless of cost. That is the best way I can describe it. I am not a man given to describing myself, and this is the truest description I have. Coroner watched me those 2 days. She went about her work and she did not say much, and she watched me. On the evening of the second day, she said, you would have stopped them. I said, yes. She said, I know, I could see it. I said, then you know what you need to know. She said, I knew it at the auction. I wanted to see it again, in a situation like this. I said, and? She said, and it's the same, exactly the same. I wrote to the county sheriff the next day and laid out the situation, and the sheriff, a man named Caldwell I had known for years, wrote out the following week and told me he had spoken to Lyle, and Lyle had no legal standing and no legal claim. And if Lyle or anyone connected to Lyle came to Pinon Creek again, there would be consequences of a kind Lyle would not enjoy. Whether Caldwell actually spoke to Lyle or simply decided the matter on his own authority, I do not know. He was that kind of sheriff. I was grateful for him. Coroner and I had a conversation in July that I have thought about many times since. We were on the porch in the evening. It was one of those July evenings in the high country where the air cools early and everything is quiet except the creek and the sound of something in the grass beyond the corral, and Ellis was asleep inside. She had her coffee and I had mine, and we were not talking, just sitting. We did a fair amount of that. It was comfortable. That is a word I do not use lightly. Comfortable is a thing 2 people earn, and it takes time and effort in the earning, and you know it when you have it. She said, Harlan, what do you want me to be here? I said, what do you mean? She said, I've been here 7 months. Ellis has your name. I keep your house and I work your place, and we have what we have. I want to know what you want me to be. I put my coffee down. I said, I don't know how to say it plainly. She said, try. I said, when I drove to that auction, I wasn't looking for anything. I was the kind of man who had stopped looking. I had made what I had into enough, and I had settled into it, and I thought that was going to be the rest of my life. Then I went around that shed wall, and there you were, and something said no. Not a thinking thing, older than thinking, something that just said this is not how this goes, and I did the only thing that was available. She waited. I said, I'm not going to say I didn't think about what it meant. I did think about it. On the drive home, I thought about the loft and the main room and the arrangements we'd made, and I knew what I'd done, and that it was going to cost me certain things I'd gotten used to, my solitude, the simplicity of the place, the shape of my days. I thought about all of that. I said, and then you got there, and you fixed my east window. She made a short sound that was almost a laugh. I said, I am serious. You fixed my east window, and you made bread, and you came out to the barn without being asked, and you held my hands warm when I couldn't feel them. And somewhere in all of that, I stopped thinking about cost and started thinking about something else. She said, "What did you start thinking about?" I said that I would like this to be real, not an arrangement, a life. That if you were willing to make it real from your side, I would not waste it. I would work at it every day I had left. I would be what a man should be to a woman and to a son. I would not go away when it was hard. I would do the thing that wanted doing without needing to be asked. I stopped. I did not usually say this many words about myself. It sat in the air for a moment. She said, "That's exactly what my mother described." I said, "I know what you told me about that." She said, "I know you know." She set her coffee on the step and looked at the creek. The light was going off it in a way that was gold and moving. She said, "I want to tell you something and I want to say it right." I waited. She said, "I have thought about leaving. I want you to know that. In February, when it was bad and the cold was bad and I felt like a charity case and a burden, I thought about it. I lay there at night and thought I could go. I could take $20 and go somewhere and find work and give this child up and start over. I thought about it clearly. I drew it out in my head what it would look like." She said, "And then I thought about my life before, my father's house, what I had been worth there, what I had been about to become at that auction. And I thought about you coming around that shed wall with your hands in your pockets saying, 'What's the transaction here?' like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like there was no question about it." I said, "There wasn't." She said, "I know there wasn't. That's the whole thing. That's the entire thing. Nobody in my life has ever just stepped in like that, like it was obvious, like of course this is what you do." She looked at me. She said, "I'd like to stay, not out of obligation. Not because I have nowhere else to go, I could find somewhere else to go, I'm capable. I'd like to stay because you're the kind of man worth staying beside. Because what my mother described, I found it, and I'm not fool enough to walk away from it." I said, "Then stay." She said, "Just like that?" I said, "Just like that." She reached out her hand and put it on my chest, over whatever was working in there, and held it there. Not my arm, not my shoulder, my chest, where a man keeps the things he doesn't say. Just held it there, feeling whatever was there. I put my hand over hers. We sat on that step while the light went off the creek, and the sky went to purple, and then to the particular dark blue of a high country evening, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. We were married in August in Doc Hendrick's front parlor with Doc and his wife and their youngest boy as witnesses. We didn't have anyone else to ask, or rather we could have, but this felt right, the three of them and us, in a room that smelled of Doc's pipe tobacco and his wife's good coffee, with Ellis in Corona's arms. Doc's wife had put flowers on the table, which I would not have thought to do, and which made it something more than a proceeding. The justice of the peace came to Doc's because I'd asked Doc to arrange it, and Doc had a way of arranging things without fuss. The justice was a small, precise man named Holt who had been doing this for 20 years and had the ceremony exactly right, nothing extra, nothing missing. It took perhaps 12 minutes. I have the picture on the shelf above the stove. Doc's wife took it in the yard afterward with the mountain behind us. Corona is in the blue dress she made herself from the fabric I bought at Hadley's, and Ellis is on her hip, and I am standing beside her with my shoulder against hers, and I am looking at her, and she is looking at the camera with the small, direct look she had, and the light is very clear. We are not performing anything for the picture. We are just there. I look at that picture sometimes in the morning before the day starts. I have looked at it for a long time now. The things it holds for me are not things I can say adequately. I have never been a man who was good at saying the adequate thing. What I can say is this. I went to the auction in December for a pair of bred heifers and Cutter Dobbs's word, and I came home with a woman who fixed my east window and a boy who had a dead soldier's first name and my last name. I did not plan this. I did not earn it in the way you plan to earn things. I just went around the end of a shed because a voice told me something was wrong, and I did the most immediate thing, and the most immediate thing turned out to be the whole direction of the rest of my life. I was 43 years old, and I had made myself into a man who did not expect his life to change. I had been wrong about that, which is one of the better mistakes I have made. There is a morning I remember from the fall of that year, the first fall after we were married, the aspens gone yellow, the air thin and cold and very bright. I was up before light as always, and I came down from the loft, and Corona was already at the stove, as she sometimes was, and Ellis was on her hip making sounds at the lamp flame, which interested him enormously. She heard me on the ladder and looked over her shoulder, and there was something in the look. Easy, familiar. The look of a woman who knows who is coming down the ladder and is not surprised, and is not anything but simply there in her life, with the man who is in it. She said, "Coffee's ready." I said, "I see that." She handed me the cup. I stood there in my own cabin with the coffee in my hand, and my wife at the stove, and my son on her hip reaching for lamplight. And outside the creek and the aspens and the cattle and the cold, clear fall air. And what I felt was something I do not have a word for, which is the feeling of a man who has come to the right place after a long time of being somewhere else, and who knows he is there, and who is not going to take it for granted. That's the answer she asked me for. In 40 years of asking, the answer never changed.